All right, excuse me. In this next lecture, we will be focusing on the action potential. Essentially what this is how nerves communicate with one another. This is how neurons generate electrical impulses so they can transmit information from point A to point B. And we'll take a look at the events that occur during this. And again, I'll be using some images from the histology website, and then again, the interactive physiology website. I strongly recommend you guys check both of these out, and especially this interactive physiology website on this, just because, you know, again, this is I'm talking about a lot of events that occur at the molecular level. You know, I mean, your imagination may only be able to stretch you so far on this, and so I strongly advise you actually see this stuff in action that I'm talking about. So when you're done listening to this video presentation, please go back and take a look at that website, because it will really help bring all of this to life after hearing the discussion.